Warhammer 40K is full of cannibals, and the grotesque practice of eating people is not something that is limited to xenos species or the followers of chaos. Oh no, cannibalism's bloody roots run deep throughout the entirety of the Imperium as well. From loyalist space marines that not only consume the flesh of their enemies, but flens their skulls and wear them as a tasteful death mask into battle. Death cults, who are on one hand condemned for their heretical cannibalistic practices, but on the other hand are viewed as valuable allies in the eradication of mankind's enemies, and many of whom will even be inducted into the Assassinorum or the Emperor's Holy Inquisition. And not to mention everybody's favorite delicious grimdark cuisine, corpse starch, which, if you're unfamiliar with it, is exactly what it sounds like. And it's fed to literally billions of people every single day. But what exactly is going on here? Why has the echlissiarchy condemned the consumption of the sacred human form as a blasphemy of the highest order, but then conveniently ignores this tenet when it comes to, say, the Space Marines? Because, fun fact, quite literally every Space Marine is a cannibal. Well, in this video, we're gonna get into that and a whole lot more, as the Imperium's complicated relationship with cannibalism is, on one hand, admittedly morbid and grotesque, but on the other hand is also deeply fascinating. But before we dive headfirst into the grimdark, I gotta tell you all about this video's sponsor. Today's sponsor is Soylent, a company that makes plant-based protein meal replacement shakes. And you may have noticed that they're named after the food in the 1973 film Soylent Green. If you know anything about that movie, you may be aware that the product in that film had one key ingredient that made it so iconic, and that was people. Soylent Green was made from people. And just like its namesake, Soylent products are made with 100% free-range people. Hey, it's me. Just wanted to do a quick little edit here and say that Soylent's products in no way, shape, or form contain people, and it was just a joke. It was just a funny little joke. Was that good? Did I do good? Soylent is the perfect synergy of macro and micronutrients backed by science. Every ingredient in their formula has been validated through clinical research to work in synergy with each other and promote a healthy lifestyle. In multiple third-party clinical studies, Soylent was shown to be effective at lowering cholesterol, improving gut microbiomes, and being an effective meal replacement. Their products range from $2 to $4 per serving, and their goal is to make nutrition complete, sustainable, accessible, appealing, and affordable for all. For me personally, with 20 grams of protein per serving, Soylent has been a delicious meal replacement when I'm grinding out on a big video and don't have time to cook or pick up lunch. It allows me to get the nutrition I need while saving me both time and money. If you want to try out Soylent for yourself, then click on the link in the description of this video, and the first 500 people to use that link, as well as my code WEST30, will get 30% off their first subscription. Again, click on the link in the description of this video and use code WEST30 to get 30% off your first subscription with Soylent. Big thanks to Soylent for sponsoring this video.
If I was to tell you that Warhammer 40K was full of cannibals, you probably wouldn't even bat an eye. I mean, of course, that makes sense. This is the franchise that coined the term grimdark after all. It's full of macabre and terrifying subject matter. Now, if I was to go a step further and tell you that it's not a practice limited to the enemies of mankind, and in fact is practiced throughout the Imperium, you might also rightfully point out that, again, 40K is a franchise that tends to remind us that the people we at first glance consider the good guys are often just as f***ed up as everybody else. But you may be unaware of just how deep cannibalistic tendencies actually run, just how widespread the practice truly is, and how oftentimes it's either blatantly ignored or even openly celebrated, despite the fact that the Imperial Creed states clearly within its doctrines that consumption of the sacred human form is a heresy of the highest order. There have been numerous instances of entire factions or human populations that practice cannibalism being declared as heretics and executed for their crimes. But despite that, when you dive into 40K's lore, you start seeing themes of cannibalism and the ritualistic drinking of blood and stuff like that pop up pretty frequently, even being openly practiced by many chapters of Space Marines. So what exactly is going on here? What are the Imperium's real views on cannibalism, and just how widespread is it within the Emperor's kingdom? To begin to understand the Imperium's complicated relationship with cannibalism, we can look no further than the most famous and meme-worthy of food products within 40K, and that is the creation and consumption of everybody's favorite grimdark cuisine, corpse starch. I'm not going to go into too much depth on what corpse starch is and the process of its creation, as that's something I've already covered pretty extensively in my Grimdark Cuisine video, so if you want all the gory details for yourself, make sure to check out that video after you finish this one, but I will briefly summarize it here just in case you're unfamiliar with it. Corpse starch is a food product created from a combination of recycled human remains as well as filler starches traditionally derived from algae that is commonly eaten by the teeming masses of the lower classes within hive cities across the galaxy. And I think it's important to make a quick side note here that the prevalence of corpse starch within the grand scheme of Warhammer 40K is often grossly exaggerated. Guardsmen across the galaxy are under normal circumstances fed adequately well, and when they are forced to utilize rations or go without, corpse starch doesn't pop up nearly as often as many of us in the community have been led to believe. But the product does exist and is most commonly associated with the hive world of Necromunda, which is both an important world within the universe of Warhammer 40K and its entirely own separate spin-off franchise. On Necromunda specifically, the creation and consumption of corpse starch solves two problems at once. First and foremost, these cities contain literally billions of people, with thousands dying every single day. If those bodies are not dealt with, then plague is likely to spread out of control. And considering that the hive cities have an enormous amount of mouths to feed, with mass starvation being a constant threat, you kill two birds with one stone by collecting all of these bodies and rendering them down into a viable food product. It's not a great solution, and admittedly it's a pretty gross one, but it's the one they've come up with. Also, fun side note, the dead are seen as a commodity by the corpse guilds of Necromunda, and by controlling their right of trade when it comes to all matters of the deceased, the creation of corpse starch has proven to be ridiculously lucrative, making the Corpse Guild one of the most influential and powerful organizations on the entirety of the planet. But this doesn't really make a lot of sense. How has such a bustling industry managed to prop up on such a famous world if their product is directly condemned by the Imperial Creed? How can the Imperium outlaw cannibalism but then feed dead bodies to an enormous portion of its population? Well, in doing research for this video, the answer is complicated, and we don't have an actual definitive source that scrutinizes this hypocrisy. But here's the thing, the Imperium is beyond massive. It controls an estimated million worlds with quintillions of people living in its borders. Although we often simplify the Imperial Creed by calling it the unified faith shared by all of humanity, the reality is that this isn't true. There are large sects of the human population that don't adhere to the Imperial Creed at all, normally people that are found on backwater worlds throughout the galaxy. And when it comes to individuals that are strict adherents of the faith, we can find variations on Emperor worship from planet to planet and sector to sector. For example, the Lexiconum states there are 13 known subcults of the Imperial Creed, but just by taking a quick look at real-world religions and how often they're broken up into many different sub-branches, the Imperial cult's variant branches are almost certain to number in the hundreds of thousands. Additionally, there exists a massive body of both sanctioned and unsanctioned dogma utilized throughout the Imperium that is the constant topic of debate within the echlissiarchy. Because a single unified faith or system of government is impossible to truly enforce, crimes like the forbidden practice of cannibalism will be seen with a fluctuating degree of severity by local officials. It's well known, for example, that there are tons of death worlds throughout the Imperium that are commonly recruited from by the Astra Militarum, and many of these worlds are ruled over by primitive tribes that practice cannibalism. It doesn't happen on all of them, but it certainly is a thing. Oftentimes when cannibalistic populations are discovered, they'll be executed without a second thought. But more often, specifically with the ones that are going to be recruited into the Imperial Guard, these people will be greeted by missionaries of the Ministorum that will attempt to guide and mold them into replacing the act of cannibalism with something else of similar ritual significance, normally taking the form of replacing the act of eating an actual person with a totem food product to maintain its symbolism whilst eliminating the heresy. Again, how it's viewed and how it's dealt with is going to vary from world to world and faction to faction. But with all that in mind, let's circle back around to corpse starch, as it's just straight up cannibalism. There's no replacement happening here. And unfortunately, in my research, I was unable to uncover any concrete excerpt that tells us why corpse starch is acceptable in the eyes of the echlissiarchy, as it seems to directly contradict what they preach. So we're gonna have to dig a little bit deeper and get a little bit more analytical in order to get to the bottom of this. So we know that on the whole, cannibalism is outlawed and seen as a sin punishable by death, but corpse starch is given the pass. And although this may seem hypocritical at first, there might actually be some logic at play here, And to better understand this, we can take a look at a particularly infamous gang on Necromunda known as the Corpse Grinder cult. If you're unfamiliar with them, they are a cannibalistic and heretical cult that was formed by individuals originally employed by the corpse guilders within their mortuary manufactorums. These are the people that were responsible for rendering down human remains in the processing facilities in order to create corpse starch. You know the old adage of you never want to see the sausage being made? Well, that's what these dudes were being subjected to literally every day. Being forced to do such a horrible but seemingly necessary job over and over again will eventually change a person. Over time, many of these workers would begin to feel this overwhelming compulsion to sample some of the unprocessed goods. Many describe it like a whisper in the back of their head that wouldn't go away. This voice that kept telling them over and over to just give in, to just take a small bite. Aren't you curious of what it actually tastes like? Those who give in to their temptation would start to go irreparably insane, and eventually you get a full-blown corpse grinder uprising, where they go absolutely nuts and butcher every single individual within the manufactorum. The surviving psychopaths then forming themselves into a cult gang that seeks to induct new members by forcing others to participate in the consumption of unprocessed human remains. And unprocessed is the key component here. As far as I'm aware, there's never been an instance of a person going insane and starting to worship chaos from eating corpse starch. In fact, it is seen as a staple food in many worlds and military regiments across the galaxy, with no type of heresy actually taking place. But on the other hand, when somebody consumes human flesh raw and unprocessed, they go full-blown chaos worshiper. And this is a theme that we're going to see pop up a few more times later in this video. So at the initial outset, it seems that by processing human meat into something that is unrecognizable as human, a process that also likely includes some form of blessing by Ministorum priests, you get a product that, although still cannibalism, is both physically and, more importantly, spiritually safe to consume. It's important to understand within the framework of 40K that cannibalism is never expressed as a good or even normal thing to do. At worst, it's a heretical sin punishable by death that opens up the door to demonic influence and possession, and at the absolute best via corpse starch, it's seen as a grim necessity, a horrible thing that humanity has been forced to do in order to survive. As a narrative device, corpse starch exists as a constant reminder of the grimdark reality of living within the 41st millennium. The reader is never allowed to become too comfortable. You're never allowed to truly get lost in the moment, to get lost in the stories of legendary heroes and the camaraderie between soldiers, as corpse starch reminds us that to be a man in such times is to live under the bloodiest regime imaginable. But let's get off of corpse starch and start talking about more Imperial cults that practice cannibalism, i.e. the death cults, as even though they have the same grim practices as the corpse grinders, they often prove to be quite useful to the Imperium as a whole, and thus are allowed to continue to exist, so long as their practices are done in the Emperor's name. Many of the members of these death cults are routinely utilized by the Assassinorum and the Inquisition, though in the latter case, it's traditionally done by inquisitors that lean more towards the path of the radical and are able to overlook the more grotesque elements of a given death cult. Death cults come in a million different forms and can be found across the entirety of the Imperium. It's impossible to truly homogenize them into one singular group, as they all have their own distinct identities, but there are some commonalities. First and foremost, their members are famed for their particular set of lethal skills centered around ritualistic death dealing. Although many of these cults have been deemed heretical due to their association with the ruinous powers, there are a sizable portion of them that are firm adherents to the Imperial Creed and devout followers of the God Emperor. To say they're a bunch of zealous, murderous psychopaths is a huge understatement, and sometimes that's exactly what an Inquisitor needs for a particular job. If members of this cult prove themselves loyal without a shadow of a doubt and are deemed to be an efficient and lethal tool for death dealing in the Emperor's name, they may be recommended to the assassin temples where they will be molded into a full-blown assassin. Within these cults, the symbolic ritualistic eating of flesh and drinking of blood taken from their enemies is a practice that is incredibly common. Many of them believe that by consuming a part of their enemy, they in turn gain a fraction of their wisdom, power, and very soul. Many of them also believe that in doing this, they are in a way purifying themselves. Now, oftentimes, blood will be siphoned off from the dead, collected in vials and containers that bear religious significance to the death cult members, and then be taken on a pilgrimage to a great cathedral of the echlissiarchy where they will present their grisly trophies to the emperor. Something I'm sure the cardinals there are mortified by. But again, these trophies were taken in the name of the emperor and from his enemies, so the cardinals just kinda let them continue doing what they're doing. Although these practices are in and of themselves seen as heretical at the offset, it's up to the individual inquisitor, priest, or imperial official that uncovers them to judge just how deep that heresy runs. Some will declare the cults heretics without even a second thought, whereas others will overlook their deranged practices if they are deemed to be useful. Hey, I'm gonna do a quick last-minute edit here, as while I was putting the finishing touches on this video, I came across some information that was relevant to the topic at hand. When I was talking about death cults here, I was mostly using the Inquisitor core rulebook from 2001, wherein death cults were more seen as a homogenous organization. There wasn't really a lot of specifics given on different types of death cults. However, in doing research for future video topics, I came across a section in the Disciples of the Dark God supplement for the Dark Heresy RPG that spoke a little bit more in depth about them. This was released 7 years later in 2008, and not only did they go into more detail about the cults, but they broke them up into 3 distinct categories, those being sanguinary, necrophagic, and revivicator cults. First and foremost, the loyalist revivicator cults are basically necromancers that seek to master life and death. They view their practices as sacred and a direct reflection of the Emperor's conquering of death. But the more interesting tidbit here is between the other two. Sanguinary cults are said to be the most common form of death cult and focus purely on the act of bloodshed. They're all said to be legendary death dealers, and although their practices are considered heretical, and a great many of them have what the book likes to call, quote, vampiric tendencies, they are seen with a certain level of tolerance, and most of these negative aspects are simply overlooked because of their implacable hatred of mankind's enemies. Sure, they may be obsessed with killing people and drinking their blood, but as far as the Imperium is concerned, they're killing the right people, so we shouldn't jump to any conclusions when judging their loyalty. However, that degree of tolerance goes right out the window with the final type of death cult, which is the necrophagic cults, i.e. cults that are defined by their cannibalistic practices and the eating of the dead. Dark Heresy tells us that these cults are never tolerated in any capacity. They often spring up on worlds that have been ravaged by incessant warfare or planet-wide famine, pandemic diseases, or other terrible disasters. In their desperation, these people will often turn to cannibalism simply as a means of survival. But in doing this, they inevitably begin to become corrupted. Their faith and devotion to the Emperor starts to twist into an obsession with human sacrifice and necrotic rituals, and thus they are easy prey for the malign predators and demonic entities within the warp. It's worth pointing out that this description is almost identical to what we are told about the corpse grinder cults on Necromunda, and the source of their lore wouldn't be released until 11 years later with the Dark Uprising expansion in 2019. Anyways, this source goes on to say that there are numerous documented cases of individuals being isolated on savage worlds or in the dark corners of spacefaring vessels as stowaways who end up giving in to cannibalism in order to survive. These individuals would often mutate into ghoulish monsters that are known as voiders. Because of the numerous examples the Inquisition has of people going insane after eating human flesh, whenever one of these necrophagic cults is discovered, the Inquisition will go to great lengths to root them out and destroy them. However, since Inquisitors are given a certain degree of autonomy to conduct their operations in any way that they see fit, it's possible there are examples that exist of such cults being utilized by the Inquisition, just like the sanguinary cults. But as a hard and fast rule of thumb, if the Inquisition finds out you're eating people and it doesn't come in the form of corpse starch, you're going to be seen as a heretic. Not so much because they find it gross or that they don't understand the individual did this in order to survive, more so because from their perspective, they have a mountain of evidence that shows that eating the sacred human form unprocessed is likely to lead to demonic possession and corruption. The chances of this happening to you go up exponentially with every bite that you take. But if you're simply drinking the blood of your enemies and you don't take it any further than that, then that's something that most likely can be overlooked. Okay, so now it seems like we have a framework for what is and isn't acceptable when it comes to cannibalism. But then GW throws a whole nother wrench into the mix because apparently the rules don't apply the same to every group and faction. For a good example of this, we can look over at the Space Marine chapters, who notably are not traditionally followers of the Imperial Creed. The vast majority of them refuse to acknowledge the Emperor as a god and cling to his original Imperial truth that forbid the worship of false deities. Because they do not follow the Imperial Creed, its tenet about cannibalism is something that oftentimes is viewed with a more nuanced perspective, while at other times is routinely ignored. Now, make no mistake, if during their mission the Space Marines come across a group of people deep in the Underhive or on a backwater world chowing down on human flesh, that's not something they're going to overlook. They're not going to see it as a totally normal thing to do and tell these Emperor-loving civilians to carry on with their day. They're going to put them down as heretics. But when it comes to themselves, every single one of them, no matter their own personal beliefs or the beliefs of their chapter, is in fact quite literally a cannibal. They were designed by the Emperor himself to be able to consume the flesh of their enemies through one of their implants known as the omniphagia. By eating a piece of a recently deceased body, the Space Marine is able to gain insight and wisdom that the consumed individual held in life. The omniphagia does this by absorbing genetic information and any DNA, RNA, or protein sequences related to experience and memory. They may gain insight into the location of nearby enemy bases, key individuals, the enemy's future plans, etc., etc. And honestly, it's an incredibly useful ability to have. But let's not mince words here, it's straight up cannibalism. And although all Space Marines are technically guilty of the sin of cannibalism, there are some that take it much farther than others. Some chapters have paid the ultimate price for the act and been declared as heretics, whereas others are still to this day seen as loyal and allowed to continue the grisly practice. The Sons of Malice, for example, were declared excommunicate traitores when an Inquisitor witnessed them committing ritualistic cannibalism after a particularly hard-fought battle. Considering that the Marines that would come to make up the chapter were taken from the world of Skelos, and the tribes there routinely practice cannibalism as part of their culture, it's no wonder the practice continued even after they became Astartes. But it didn't matter, they were still declared heretics. The Blood Angels, on the other hand, are possibly the most famous of all Space Marine cannibals, as they have a gene defect known as the Red Thirst that, for all intents and purposes, turns them into full-blown vampires that hunger for blood. If they go too long without partaking, they can start becoming more aggressive and feral, and even eventually, in extreme cases, turn into full-blown monsters. Because of this, the ritualistic drinking of blood to stave off the worst effects of the thirst has been part of just about every single Blood Angels chapter in one form or another. And many take the act to far more extreme levels. The Flesh Tearers, for example, are far more prone to suffer the ill effects of the thirst and the Black Rage, and are noted for both their savagery in battle and an almost fatalistic attitude towards who and what they are, embracing some of their more barbaric tendencies. In order to curb some of the more extreme levels of the Red Thirst, though, they do have these massive farm-like facilities on their home planet where baseline humans are drained of their blood in order to make sure the chapter always has a fresh supply. They are definitely seen as a more extreme example of cannibalistic Blood Angels, but whereas they do put some limits on their practices, the Knights of Blood, on the other hand, throw all that right out the window, and just fully embraced being monsters. I covered this in a lot more detail in my Blood Angels vampire video, so check that out if you're interested. But I'll quickly say that the Knights of Blood were particularly deranged. They saw human beings as beneath them, cattle simply to be fed upon. Their feeding habits routinely having been portrayed as being particularly cruel and callous. Although the majority of Blood Angel chapters today are not as extreme as these two examples, back before the coming of Sanguinius, they looked a lot more like the Knights of Blood. Whenever they were involved in an engagement, it was said that it was common to see the sight of blood-smeared angels stalking the fallen and wounded champions of the enemy forces across fields choked with corpses. They would routinely hang around on the battlefield long after the fighting was over and all of the other armies had gone home to feast on the dead. There were even times when they wouldn't even wait for the fighting to be over. They would just go full-blown cannibal in the middle of a war zone, the horrific sight immediately causing the enemy to break and panic to spread throughout their ranks. After Sanguinius had been located and was reunited with his gene sons, he would go to great lengths to curb most of their bloody tendencies. When the Blood Angels would indulge, it would be done so in secret and with ritualistic significance. Sanguinius swore that when the fighting of the Horus Heresy was over and his wayward brother was finally defeated, he would dedicate everything he had to finding a cure for the Red Thirst. But as we all tragically know, this never came to pass. Although the Blood Angels are certainly the most famous of Space Marines to have engaged in cannibalism, they are certainly not the only ones amongst the Loyalist forces. The Mortifactors, a successor chapter of the Ultramarines, being another prime example. This chapter's members were recruited from the feral world of Basul, which was said to be perpetually clouded in darkness and ruled over by a bunch of feral tribes that practiced cannibalism. Even though today, these Space Marines are firm adherents of the Codex Astartes, and many of their original tribal customs are still practiced to this day. Not only do they symbolically eat the flesh and drink the blood of their slain enemies, they also have this particularly macabre practice of decapitating their foe and flensing their skull. The skulls can be used for a variety of different purposes, whether being worn as trophies, put on display within their holds amongst thousands of other skulls, or worn over their face masks. As grisly and grotesque as the act of cannibalism is, and even though it is seen as a heretical sin by the echlissiarchy, it is something that has been practiced across the galaxy within the Imperium for thousands of years, and most likely isn't going to go away anytime soon. But what do you think of all this? Do you think that the echlissiarchy needs to be more ruthless in putting a stop to this wherever it appears? What do you think about corpse starch? Is it simply a grim necessity or a direct expression of ecclesiarchal hypocrisy? Do you think the Sons of Malice were done dirty in comparison to the Mortifactors being given a free pass to eat people? Let me know all of your thoughts, comments, and questions down in the comment section below. As you all know, I read just about every single one of them and try to reply to as many of them as I can. Oftentimes you guys will have read source material that I haven't touched yet and come up with some pretty remarkable insights into this universe. Sorry about my voice being off in this one, I'm getting over this crazy head cold and it is really difficult to sound normal when you can't breathe out of your nose. Anyways, big thanks to everyone who supports the work that I do, and I will catch you all in the next one.